A CEO slapped a single dad in a cafe. Then her bodyguard froze when he saw his scar. A true real-life story. Full narration script. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a room full of people, a restaurant, a bus, a waiting area, and felt completely invisible? Like no matter what you did, nobody would notice you were even there? Like you could disappear and it wouldn't change a single thing for anyone around you? Most of us have felt that, and most of us have learned, over time, to just accept it, to keep our heads down, to not make a fuss, to just get on with it. But here's the thing about invisible people. Sometimes they are carrying the most extraordinary stories. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who did something the rest of the world will never fully understand. And sometimes, just sometimes, life has a way of pulling back the curtain at exactly the right moment. This is one of those stories. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the middle of October, in a mid-sized city that gets cold fast and doesn't apologize for it. The kind of morning where the sky is gray from the moment it opens its eyes, and people on the street are already a little irritated before their day has even properly started. Nobody was expecting anything unusual. Nobody was looking for a lesson. People just wanted their coffee and their commute and a few hours where nothing went wrong. But life doesn't really ask permission before it decides to change things. Let's go back a little further than the coffee shop. Because to really understand what happened in those few minutes, you need to understand the kind of man Adam was in the ordinary hours of his life. Not the extraordinary ones, the ordinary ones. Adam's alarm went off at 5:30 every weekday morning, not because his shift started that early. It didn't, not usually. It was because 5:30 was the only time in the entire day that belonged to him completely. Before Zara woke up, before the school run, before work, just the quiet of the apartment, the sound of the city outside barely getting started, a cup of tea that he made properly and drank sitting by the kitchen window. He had started doing this about 8 months after his wife passed away. The grief counselor he had seen for 3 sessions, and then stopped seeing, not because it wasn't helping but because the sessions were on Wednesday evenings and he couldn't sort the childcare, had said something that had stayed with him. She had said, "Find one thing every day that is yours. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be yours." The 5:30 cup of tea was his thing. He was very protective of it. He had once had a neighbor who called at 5:45 on a Saturday morning with what they felt was an urgent drainage question, and Adam had been polite on the phone and quietly furious for about an hour afterward. That Tuesday morning, he had sat in his usual spot and looked out the window at the street below, where a delivery driver was unloading boxes from a van with the patient efficiency of someone who has done this exact thing so many times it no longer requires thought. Adam watched him for a while. He found this sort of thing restful, other people's competence, the quiet dignity of a job done well without anyone watching. He had been thinking about a Saturday shift request from his foreman. He had been thinking about money, as he often did in the quiet morning, not with panic, but with the steady, practical attention of someone who has learned to manage a thin margin. The numbers were always fine, if you were careful, but fine was different from easy, and sometimes in the early morning, the gap between fine and easy felt wider than it did in the daytime when there were things to do. Zara had woken up at 6:45, which was later than usual, and therefore a minor miracle. She had padded into the kitchen in her socks and announced that she had dreamed about a horse that could read, and that she thought this was important. Adam had told her that it sounded very important, and had made her the small bowl of oat porridge that was her Tuesday morning standard, and had listened seriously as she developed the plot of the reading horse dream with the unself-conscious creativity of a child who has not yet learned to doubt her own imagination. He had done her hair. She wanted 2 braids that day, which meant the more complicated version, and he had got them right on the second attempt. He had learned, over the past 2 years, that getting the braids right mattered quite a lot. Not because Zara was vain, she wasn't, particularly, but because getting them right was a form of attention, and she noticed attention the way a plant notices sunlight. They had left the apartment at 7:52. The school was a 12-minute walk, but they had stopped at the crossing to watch a pigeon that was standing very still in the middle of the pavement with the air of a bird that had made a decision and was not going to be rushed. Zara had opinions about the pigeon. They arrived at the coffee shop at 8:04, which was fine because school didn't start until 9 and the Tuesday ritual had never yet made them late. His name was Adam, and if you had seen him that morning, you would have thought absolutely nothing of him. That was not an accident. Adam had spent years learning how to walk through the world in a way that drew no attention. Worn jacket, work boots with dried mud on the left toe, a canvas bag over one shoulder that had seen better days about 3 years ago. He looked like what he was, a working man, tired, running a little late, doing his best. He was 34 years old. He had the kind of face that looks like it used to smile more easily than it does now. Not unfriendly, just careful. Like someone who has learned that the world doesn't always reward openness and has quietly adjusted. Adam was a single father. His daughter's name was Zara, and she was 7 years old, and she was, without question, the best thing in his life and the most exhausting thing in his life, often in the same hour. She had her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet humor, and she had a habit of asking very precise questions about things that adults generally try not to think about too carefully. Why do some people have less food? Why do buildings have no one living in them when people sleep outside? Why does that man look sad? Her mother had passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. The fast kind. The kind that doesn't give you enough time to adjust before it's already over. Adam had gone from husband and co-parent to a solo act almost overnight, and he had done what people in that situation tend to do. He kept moving. He picked up extra shifts. He rearranged the apartment so Zara had the bigger room. He learned how to do the kind of braid she liked in her hair after watching videos 17 times. He did not talk about how hard it was. He just did it. He worked as a senior electrician for a mid-size contractor. Good at his job. Reliable. The kind of worker foremen call first when something complicated needs doing. He made decent money. Not comfortable money, but enough, if he was careful. And he was always careful. The apartment was small but clean. Zara's school fees were always paid on time. The heat stayed on. What nobody at his job knew, what nobody in his current life really knew, was what was under his left sleeve. A scar, long and jagged, running from his inner wrist to just below his elbow, pale against his skin, shaped a little like a bolt of lightning if you looked at it a certain way. He had stopped looking at it a certain way a long time ago. To him it was just there, like a piece of furniture you stop noticing after a while. But that scar had a story, a very specific story, the kind you don't tell over lunch. Adam had served 2 tours in the military. He had been deployed overseas in his mid-20s, in the middle of a conflict that most people back home followed loosely on the news and forgot about when the next story came along. He had done his job. He had come home. He had tried, with varying degrees of success, to leave that chapter behind. The scar came from an incident that his discharge papers described in 2 clinical sentences. What those sentences didn't describe was what actually happened, which was that Adam had gone back into a burning vehicle 3 times to pull out the men trapped inside. The heat had been so intense that the skin on his forearm had blistered within the first 30 seconds. He had not stopped. He had come back a second time, and a third time, and he had gotten all 3 of them out. One of them had not survived his injuries. 2 had. He had received a commendation. He kept it in a box in his closet, under some old tax returns, because he had never quite known what to do with it. He never talked about any of this. Not to his neighbors, not to his co-workers, not really even to his late wife, beyond the bare minimum. Some things you carry quietly, and you just get used to the weight. On this particular Tuesday morning, Adam's 2 goals were simple: drop Zara at school and stop at the coffee shop on the corner for a hot chocolate, one for him, one small one for her, before her school day started. It was their Tuesday ritual. She insisted on it. He had tried, once, to skip it because they were running late, and she had looked at him with such silent, dignified disappointment that he had never suggested it again. The coffee shop was called Brewer's Corner. Not fancy, not rough, just a neighborhood place that smelled like espresso and something with cinnamon baking in the back. There were wooden tables, an exposed brick, and a chalk menu board that someone had clearly spent a lot of time making look casual. Adam liked it, because nobody bothered you there. You could just sit. He ordered their drinks, found a corner table near the window, and sat down with Zara beside him. She immediately pulled a small notebook from her school bag and started drawing. Adam looked at his phone, thinking about the Saturday shift, calculating, not quite present, when the door opened and the atmosphere of the room shifted. It's hard to explain exactly how some people do that, walk into a space and change it without saying a word, but some people do, and Victoria Crane was one of them. Victoria Crane was 41 years old, and she had spent most of those 41 years in a very deliberate hurry. She was the founder and CEO of a technology consulting firm that she had built from a laptop and a rented desk in her late 20s into something that now had offices in 4 cities and employed nearly 800 people. She had been on the cover of 2 business magazines. She had given a speech at a conference that got clipped and shared online hundreds of thousands of times. She was, by any measure the business world uses to keep score, extraordinarily successful. She had also grown up in circumstances that were, by most measures, ordinary. Not wealthy, not impoverished. The solid, unremarkable middle that produces most of the world's eventual overachievers. Her father had worked in insurance. Her mother had been a secondary school teacher of geography, which Victoria had genuinely loved as a subject, and still found herself reading about in whatever free time she had. She had been ambitious from an early age. She had worked very hard, for a very long time, to build something real. She was proud of it. She had a right to be. But somewhere in the decades of building, she had developed a kind of tunnel vision that she had never properly examined. The world had gradually divided, in her internal map of it, into 2 categories: people and things that were relevant to her goals, and everything that wasn't. The second category, which included most people she encountered in most public spaces, had become, without her quite deciding this, essentially invisible to her. She didn't think of herself as someone who looked down on people. She would have been genuinely offended by that description. She thought of herself as focused, as someone who had too much to do and too little time. But there is a difference between being focused and deciding, quietly, that other people's basic dignity is something you can get around to later. And Victoria had not yet been made to see that difference clearly. On this particular morning, she was 14 minutes behind her first meeting, which was 14 minutes more than she ever allowed herself. Her assistant had forgotten to pre-order her coffee. The line at Brewer's Corner was longer than she expected. She was looking at her phone as she moved toward the pickup counter, reading something that was making her expression tight. She didn't see the table, or rather, she saw it, technically, the way you see obstacles when you're moving fast and thinking faster. But she didn't adjust. Her arm caught the edge of Adam's cup as she passed. Not a hard knock. Enough. The cup tilted. A small arc of hot chocolate landed on the hem of her coat. Victoria stopped. She looked down at her coat. She looked at Adam. And then she did something that the 12 other people in that room would spend the next several days thinking about, each of them in their own way. She raised her hand, and she slapped him. It was not dramatic, the way it might look in a film. It was sharp and quick and almost dismissive, like swatting something away. Like the gesture was not really about anger, but about removing an inconvenience. Like he was something that had gotten in her way and needed to be informed of this. She said, "Do you have any idea who I am?" And then she turned back toward the counter. The coffee shop went completely silent. Not gradually, all at once. The espresso machine was the only thing still making noise for about 4 full seconds, and then even the person operating it stopped, as though they'd only just noticed something important was happening. Adam had not moved. He was sitting very still, his hands flat on the table, looking at the spot where his cup had been. Zara's crayon had stopped moving across the page. She was looking at her father with the specific attentiveness of a child who can feel that something has happened that the adults around her have not yet finished reacting to. And here is the thing about Adam, the thing that says more about who he is than anything else in this story. He didn't shout. He didn't stand up. He didn't make a scene. He looked at his daughter's face, and whatever was moving through him in that moment, the shock, the humiliation, the anger, all of it. He held it. Quietly, completely. He reached for a napkin to clean the spilled drink from the table, and that is when everything changed. Victoria never went anywhere without security. She had received enough unpleasant attention over the years that keeping a close protection officer had become standard practice. His name was Leon. Leon was 38 years old, former Army Ranger, 2 deployments, an exit that was quieter than he would have liked, due to a shoulder injury that healed well but not completely. He had worked in private security for 6 years, the last 4 with Victoria. He was good at his job in the way that only comes from genuinely paying attention. He noticed things. He was already reading the room as they entered, tracking exits, logging variables, reading the body language of the people around them with the automatic efficiency of long practice. When Victoria's hand came up and made contact with Adam's face, Leon had already started moving forward. His job was to position himself between Victoria and any escalation, and escalation was what his training told him would follow. He was calculating the room. He was not thinking about forearms. Then Adam reached for the napkin. The sleeve of his jacket shifted, just a few centimeters. Enough. Leon stopped walking. He stopped so completely and so suddenly that he looked, for a moment, like someone had paused a video. His right foot was still in the air from his last step. He set it down slowly. He was staring at Adam's arm, at the scar, long and jagged, pale against the skin, running from the inner wrist toward the elbow. Leon had only ever seen one mark exactly like that in his life. He saw it every morning in his own mirror. His version, on his right forearm, same origin, same fire, like the heat had left identical signatures on 2 different people and sent them into the world without introduction. He knew that scar the way you know a piece of a story that you have been carrying for 11 years with no ending. 11 years ago, in a conflict zone overseas, Leon had been in a vehicle when an explosive device went off underneath it. The vehicle had caught fire. He had been unconscious. And someone whose name he had learned afterward from the after-action report, a name he had never been able to match to a face, had gone back into that burning metal 3 times and pulled out the men inside. Leon had been the 3rd one out. He had the medical records from what followed. He had the scar from the heat. He had spent the better part of a decade quietly wondering if he would ever actually meet the man he had never been able to properly thank. Victoria noticed that her bodyguard had stopped moving. She turned to look at him, confused. She followed his gaze to the man at the corner table and saw nothing that explained the expression on Leon's face. She said his name, quietly. Leon did not respond. Let's stay with Leon for a moment, because his side of this story deserves more than a few sentences. When Leon came home from his 2nd deployment, he had spent 4 months in a military hospital and then another 6 months in rehabilitation for his shoulder. The discharge process had been, in the blunt way that bureaucratic processes often are, simply the closing of a door. There had been paperwork and a handshake and a packet of information about veteran support services, and then he was standing outside in ordinary clothes feeling like a person who had had a long and defining chapter of their life ended in roughly the same administrative fashion as canceling a subscription. He had found his footing, eventually. Private security work was a natural fit. It used the skills he had, kept him moving, gave him structure. He was good at it. And over 4 years with Victoria, he had come to understand her in the way that close protection officers often do, not as friends, but with the particular clarity that comes from observing someone closely in a very wide variety of situations. He knew when she was genuinely tired versus performing tiredness to get out of social obligations. He knew that she was harder on herself than she was on anyone else, and that she covered it poorly. The search for Adam, he would not have called it a search, out loud, to anyone. It was more like a background process. Something running quietly underneath everything else. He had a name from the after-action report. He had no face. He had tried once, through old contacts to find a current address, and had hit enough walls that he'd let it go. He had told himself, at various points, that it didn't matter, that the gratitude was real whether it was expressed or not. He believed all of that, and he also carried it, quietly, underneath everything else, every day, When he saw the scar on Adam's arm in that coffee shop, the feeling that went through him was so large and so sudden that he genuinely did not know, for a moment, what to do with his own body. He had been in firefights that produced less of a physiological response. His hands were shaking slightly as he crossed the room. He noticed this with the clinical detachment of someone trained to observe themselves under stress, and he kept moving. He crossed the coffee shop floor. He walked to Adam's table and crouched down, lowered himself to eye level with the seated man, which was a strange thing for someone of his build to do, and was quiet for a moment, looking at the forearm. Then he looked up. He said very quietly, "3rd Battalion, 2013. The vehicle was a Humvee. There were 3 of us inside." He paused. "You went back 3 times." Adam had gone very still. He looked at Leon's face for a long time. Then he looked at the forearm Leon had instinctively raised slightly. At the matching mark there. He looked back up. He said, "You're Leon." Just like that. Like a door opening after a long time closed. Leon's face did something that the people nearby would later describe differently, but always with the same word underneath it. Broke. Not crumpled, not collapsed, just opened. Like a man who had been holding something together for a very long time and had just, finally, been given permission to set it down. He said, "Yeah, I'm Leon." Zara had been watching all of this with total focus. She looked at the large man kneeling by their table. She said, in her clearest voice, "Are you my dad's friend?" Leon looked at her. He blinked once. He said, "Your dad saved my life. So yes. I think that makes us friends." Zara considered this, found it satisfactory, and went back to her horse drawing. The whole coffee shop had been watching, not rudely, but the way people watch something they understand they are not supposed to interrupt. The espresso machine had been turned off. Nobody was on their phone. 12 people were just present, and very quiet. Victoria Crane had been standing at the pickup counter the entire time. She is not a woman who is often lost for what to do. Her entire professional life has been built on making fast decisions in complex situations. That clarity is a big part of how she got where she is. But she had no clarity right now. She was watching her bodyguard, a man she had worked alongside for 4 years, a man she had never once seen rattled by anything, kneeling on the floor of a coffee shop with tears on his face that he wasn't attempting to hide. And slowly, piece by piece, she was assembling the shape of what had just happened. The man she had slapped was not a nobody. She didn't know the full story yet, but she was smart enough to understand that whatever had just passed between Leon and this stranger at the corner table was not something small. Leon did not have small reactions. He barely had visible reactions. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was significant, and she had walked in here and made it worse. She picked up her coffee from the counter. She looked at it. She set it back down. She walked over to the table. Adam looked up when she reached them. His expression was not what she expected. She had braced for anger, open, justified anger. What she got instead was something quieter, and honestly, harder to sit with. He just looked at her, like he was waiting to see what kind of person she was going to be in the next 30 seconds. Victoria was not accustomed to people looking at her like that. She was accustomed to people being careful around her. Nobody looked at her the way this man was looking at her, like she was being weighed, and the result wasn't yet decided, and she should probably think carefully about what she said next. She said, "I don't have an excuse for what I just did." Adam said nothing. She said, "I was running late. I wasn't paying attention, and I made a decision that was wrong. I want to be honest about that." Still nothing from Adam. He let the silence do the work, and it did a lot of work. Zara looked up from her notebook. She looked at Victoria with the unfiltered directness that 7-year-olds are capable of, the kind that adults spend decades learning to soften and eventually lose altogether. She said, "You should say sorry. That's what my dad always tells me when you hurt someone, even if it was an accident. You still have to say sorry." Victoria looked at the child. Something passed across her face that the watching people couldn't entirely name. Not quite guilt, not quite humility. Something in between those things that maybe didn't have a word yet. She looked back at Adam. She said, "I'm sorry, Adam, genuinely." The word genuinely came out with effort behind it. Like it cost something. Like she had to decide, for a fraction of a second, whether she was actually willing to mean it, and then decided that she was. Adam looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, small and slow. Not warm. He wasn't going to perform forgiveness for an audience, but real. An acknowledgement. He said, "All right." 2 syllables, but enough to release the pressure in the room. People started breathing normally again. The espresso machine came back on. Very slowly, Brewer's Corner returned to something like its usual self. What Victoria did not tell anyone, not her communications team, not the board, not even the friend she called that evening, was what she did after she left the coffee shop. She sat in her car in the parking structure with the engine off for 12 minutes. She sat there and thought about the word invisible, not as a concept, not as a business insight, but as a feeling. She tried to remember the last time she had felt invisible and could not get further back than her early 20s. She thought about what it might be like to feel that way every day, to move through spaces where people looked straight through you, to be slapped in a coffee shop and have the room go quiet not because anyone was going to stand up for you, but because everyone was frozen. She thought about Adam holding it, just sitting there, looking at his daughter. She sat in the car for 12 minutes, and then she drove to the office, and she went up to her floor, and she sat at her desk. Eventually her assistant brought in a coffee and she thanked them, which she noticed she almost never did. That small observation sat unpleasantly with her for the rest of the morning. The meeting she had been rushing to, the one she had been so certain she couldn't be late for, 2 of the other participants were running 20 minutes behind anyway. She had been sitting in the conference room for 15 minutes before they showed up. She did not find this funny, but she noted it. Someone in the coffee shop had recorded part of what happened. Not the whole thing. They'd grabbed their phone late. What they captured was about 40 seconds. Leon kneeling at the table, and Zara's line to Victoria, and the apology. They posted it with almost no context. Within 2 days, the video had been seen by a very large number of people. The comments split. Some focused on the slap, some on Leon's face, some on the little girl's voice. A few journalists picked it up. Victoria's communications team sent her 3 different crisis response strategies. Victoria read the message. She thought about it for about an hour. Then she wrote back and told them to stand down, and wrote a statement herself. It was 2 paragraphs long. It did not use the words context, or regret, or if anyone was offended. It said, simply, that she had acted badly, that she was sorry, and that being sorry didn't erase it, but it was what was true. The statement cost her professionally. A partnership she had been negotiating for 4 months fell through. The other company's board felt it reflected poorly on their potential association, and they withdrew. Victoria learned about this in a call that lasted less than 5 minutes, thanked them for letting her know, and hung up. She told her own board about the partnership loss at their next meeting and did not attempt to spin it. She said, "This is the cost. I accept it." The board members were quiet for a moment, and then they moved on. She also called Leon into her office. It was a private conversation, and neither of them ever talked publicly about exactly what was said. What Leon did share, later, with a very small number of people, was that she had asked him to tell her about Adam. And he had. He had told her the whole story. The vehicle, the fire, the arm going back in a 3rd time when any reasonable person would have stopped. And he said that Victoria had listened without interrupting, which, for people who knew her, was not a given. Leon requested a leave of absence. Victoria approved it without asking any questions. She simply said, "Take whatever time you need." He booked 2 weeks. He went home to where his sister lived, about 4 hours away, and helped her renovate her kitchen, and took her dogs for very long walks, and slept more than he had in years. On the last day of the 2 weeks, he sat on his sister's porch in the early morning with a cup of coffee, and just stayed there for a while, not doing anything, not going anywhere, just present in the morning. And it felt like something had been resolved that he hadn't known was open. And then there was what happened with Adam. He received a phone call 4 days after the coffee shop incident, not from Victoria directly, from someone at her company's administrative office. They explained that the company had made a donation, in his name, to a veterans support organization, and they asked, carefully, whether he would be willing to meet with Victoria. They made clear it was entirely his choice. No legal purpose. She simply wanted to speak with him, person to person. Adam almost said no. He sat with the question for a full evening after Zara had gone to sleep, in the quiet of the apartment with the television off, turning it over in his mind. He was not a person who held on to anger. It was too heavy, and he had learned a long time ago that you have to choose carefully what you carry. But he also wasn't sure what the point of the meeting would be. He'd gotten his apology. She'd had her public accounting. Everyone had moved on, except that he kept thinking about Zara's voice in the coffee shop. That matter-of-fact instruction, you should say sorry, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and he thought about the fact that he was raising her, and that she was watching him, and that the choices he made in moments like this were part of what she was learning about how to be a person in the world. He called back in the morning and said yes. He wore his work jacket. He didn't dress up. He drove himself to the glass building in the city center and took the elevator to the 38th floor and walked out into a lobby with views of the water on 3 sides. Victoria was waiting for him there, not in her office, in the lobby itself. She was wearing less formal clothes than he'd expected. She looked, for the first time, like a person who was a little uncertain about how something was going to go. She extended her hand. He shook it. They sat by the windows and had a conversation that lasted just under 2 hours. Neither of them has shared everything that was said, but Adam did share this. At one point, Victoria asked him what he actually wanted out of the situation. Not from her company, personally. What did he want? He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I want my daughter to grow up in a world where people like you actually see people like me, not as obstacles, as people." And Victoria was quiet, and then she said, "Then stay long enough to tell me where I missed." And he did. And Zara did not fully understand what had happened in the coffee shop. She understood that a lady had done something unkind to her father, and that a big man had said something that made him look different. Not upset, but different, in a way she found hard to name. She understood that she had said a thing, and that the lady had listened, which was satisfying. She had asked Adam about it that evening while he was making dinner, not in a worried way, more the way she approached most mysteries, with curiosity, and the assumption that there was an interesting answer available if you asked the right question. She had asked, "Why did that man cry?" Adam had been stirring pasta. He paused. He said, "Because sometimes you spend a long time looking for something, and then you find it, and you didn't expect it to happen today. And that can make you feel a lot of things at once." Zara thought about this. She said, "Is it like when you can't find something, and then it was in your pocket the whole time?" Adam said, "A bit like that, yeah." She went back to drawing, and a little while later, from across the room, she said, "I think that man is going to be our friend." Adam looked over at her. He said, "I think you might be right." She said simply, "Good," and went back to the horse. Here is what changed after that, and here is what didn't. What changed? Victoria's company quietly created a new staff position, a coordinator focused on veterans' employment pathways, not announced, not put in a press release, just created, budgeted, and filled within 2 months. The person they hired had done 2 deployments herself and had a background in workforce development. What changed? Leon came back from his leave of absence with something slightly different about him that his coworkers noticed but couldn't quite name. He was the same in all the ways that mattered, but there was something slightly less braced about him, like a tension had been released that had been there so long he'd stopped feeling it. What changed? Zara started asking fewer questions about why some people were sad, and more questions about what was the right thing to do when you saw it. Which, as shifts go, is a meaningful one. What didn't change? Adam went back to work. He covered the Saturday shift, because Zara's Friday concert was wonderful, and he was there, and she spotted him in the 4th row and gave him a wave that made the woman next to him smile. He went back to the double shifts and the school runs and the Tuesday hot chocolate ritual. He added exactly one new thing to his schedule. Once a month, on a Saturday morning, he and Leon met for breakfast at Brewer's Corner. They almost never talked about what had happened in the military. Not because it was off limits. It just wasn't the point anymore. They talked about Zara's horse drawings, which Leon found genuinely impressive. They talked about basketball, and about a street in Leon's neighborhood that had a pothole the city kept promising to fix. They talked about good coffee and bad weather, and the particular aggravation of furniture that comes with too many parts, and instructions that make no sense. They talked like two people who had been through something enormous together and had made it to the other side, and now all they wanted was to be normal for a while. To sit somewhere warm and have breakfast and not be extraordinary. Just people. That was what they wanted, and that was what they had. I want to leave you with something before we go. There is a version of this story where the most important thing that happens is the slap. Where the drama is the confrontation, the video, the public apology, the business consequences. And those things are real, they happened. But I don't think that's actually what this story is about. I think it's about a man who had already done something extraordinary, years before anyone in that coffee shop knew his name, who had made a choice, in a moment of fire and panic, that nobody required him to make, and who had carried that quietly, without complaint, without looking for credit, folding it into the ordinary routine of school runs and double shifts and Tuesday hot chocolates. I think it's about a little girl who understood, instinctively, what adults forget to say. I think it's about a man who had 11 years of gratitude built up with nowhere to put it, finally getting to set it down. And yes, I think it's also about a woman who was handed a mirror at the worst possible moment and made a choice about what to do with what she saw. Every day, in every city, there are people walking past us who are carrying things we know nothing about. Extraordinary things, quiet things, heavy things. People who did something brave and never told anyone. People who are holding a family together with both hands and smiling like everything is fine. People who are, in their own way, doing something remarkable and doing it invisibly. We don't always get to know their stories. Most of the time, we walk right past them and never find out. But sometimes, just sometimes, something shifts. A cup tips, a sleeve catches, a scar surfaces, and just for a moment, the curtain pulls back and you see the whole thing. When that happens, what do you do with it? That's the question this story is really asking, and I hope, genuinely hope, that when your moment comes, you get the answer right. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.